Now, police in Kenya have opened fire during fresh clashes with protesters in the capital, Nairobi. Police also used whips on the protesters. Demonstrations.
It started with a scream, then a gunshot, then another. In the heart of Nairobi, something irreversible happened. On June 25, 2024, Kenya crossed a line it can no longer uncross. Police opened fire on unarmed protesters demonstrating against a controversial finance bill. The street, once filled with chants, turned into a river of silence and blood. Bodies fell. Anger rose. But this wasn't just about taxes. This was about betrayal. A crack that had been widening beneath the surface finally split open in daylight. Kenya, long seen as a pillar of democratic growth in East Africa, suddenly found itself trembling under the weight of its own system. The protests that followed weren't just responses to one event, they were responses to years of tension, silenced voices, and unheeded warnings. The youth didn't just protest. They moved like lightning. From Nairobi to Mombasa, Eldoret to Kisumu, they rose in defiance. Their slogans pierced through news feeds and barriers alike. We are tired. Justice or nothing. Our must go. By mid-2025, the numbers were staggering. Over 126 dead, according to human rights groups. The government rejected those figures, but the internet told another story. Videos streamed in real time. Live streams captured chaos. Eyewitnesses cried into their phones. Families waited outside morgues, desperate for answers they never received. The flashpoint came with the death of Albert Ojwang, a blogger, a voice, a symbol. Outspoken, sharp, and critical of the administration, Albert was detained under suspicious circumstances. Days later, he was returned to his family, silent, lifeless, broken. That moment wasn't just personal grief. It was national ignition. The streets flooded. Candlelight vigils turned into walls of resistance. Within hours, #Justice for Ojwang was trending not just in Kenya, but across the continent. The movement evolved. No longer was it about one bill or one death. It became about dignity. About a generation that refused to remain silent. And what was the government's answer? Not reform. Not empathy. But more bullets. Nairobi's central business district transformed into a front line. Where traffic and trade once ruled, now there were barricades built from burned cars, echoes of chants, and the thunder of stun grenades. Drones watched from above. Undercover officers arrested suspected organizers in daylight. Some never came back. And yet, despite the blood, the fear, the censorship, the movement didn't die. It grew. Stronger. Louder. More strategic. Because when you push people to the edge, you don't just awaken resistance. You awaken clarity. The youth no longer trusted speeches. They built their own networks. Their own safety nets. Their own systems of truth. And while all eyes focused on the cities, another tragedy was unfolding in silence, one not of tear gas, but of smoke and ash. Kenya's forests, its lungs, its guardians, were burning. Literally. And no one was paying attention. But that fire, too, wasn't natural. It was connected. A symptom of the same sickness, silence, neglect, and the slow collapse of systems that were supposed to protect. What began as a protest against a bill had become a nationwide reckoning. Political unrest in the cities. Environmental catastrophe in the countryside. And in the center, a generation refusing to disappear. What happens when both the streets and the trees burn at the same time? When justice and nature both scream for help and are met with silence? That's the question Kenya is now forced to answer, and we are all witnesses. They thought the flames would scare them. That the smoke would choke the movement. But fear had already run its course. What rose from the ashes wasn't panic, it was purpose. Young people began organizing beyond the streets. Safe houses were established, digital networks secured, encrypted messages shared like lifelines. They weren't waiting for permission. They were building their own protection against a system that had failed them. Meanwhile, the government doubled down. Curfews were imposed without warning. Schools shut down. Internet throttled. Anyone with a camera or voice was labeled a threat. But it was too late. Truth had gone viral. The state-controlled narrative collapsed under the weight of real-time footage, unfiltered grief, and undeniable courage. People didn't just share posts, they shared pain. They saw their friends, their neighbors, their classmates bleeding in the streets. And they knew, this wasn't just another protest. It was a national mirror reflecting decades of inequality and political decay. Then came the forest fires. What the media barely mentioned began creeping into headlines only when the smoke reached the capital. Thousands of acres of indigenous forest went up in flames, forests long protected by law, home to wildlife, culture, and critical climate balance. At first, they blamed the weather. Then they blamed farmers. But satellite images told a different story: organized burn patterns, timed land clearings, coordinated destruction. Behind the flames, corporate interests waited with bulldozers. The green cover was being erased not by accident, but by design. And still, the people marched. From city squares to scorched earth, Kenyans began drawing the line. Activists like Nadine Otieno emerged, young, fierce, unbought. Her voice shook parliament chambers as she screamed, "You do not own this country." They tried to silence her too. Raids, threats, surveillance. But the more they tried to erase her, the louder she became. Her speeches were clipped into TikToks, broadcast into exile communities, translated into Swahili, Kikuyu, Luo. She wasn't just a protester, she was a movement wrapped in flesh and fire. And while the police cracked down, another shadow moved beneath the chaos. Private security firms, foreign-funded, lightly regulated, began appearing at the edges of protest zones. They weren't wearing uniforms. They wore suits, earpieces, moved with the confidence of men who knew no law could touch them. Who hired them? No one knew. Or rather, no one dared say. But whispers began to circulate, foreign investors linked to land deals, oil contracts, infrastructure corridors. The same hands that burned forests were funding surveillance on the youth fighting for justice. A silent war was unfolding, one over who gets to shape Kenya's future. And yet, through it all, the people didn't stop. If anything, they became more strategic. Where one march was blocked, 2 more sprang up. Where one voice was silenced, 10 more echoed. Makeshift radio stations began broadcasting from rooftops. Digital journalists stitched together footage that rivaled national news. And in every image, one truth remained: this was no longer about just surviving. This was about reclaiming. Reclaiming the forests. The truth. The future. Because in the eyes of this generation, silence is complicity. And they had been silent long enough. As the weeks passed, international media began to catch on. Headlines started changing. No longer unrest in Nairobi, but mass youth uprising and environmental crimes in Kenya. But with attention came risk. Foreign embassies issued warnings. Aid budgets were reconsidered. Sanctions whispered in diplomatic halls. Pressure began to mount not just on the protesters, but on the country itself. Kenya was being cornered, externally and internally. And somewhere, deep within the smoke and speeches, a question kept surfacing. If both the people and the land are screaming, and no one in power listens, what happens next? That's what we're about to find out. Power doesn't just fear resistance, it fears organization. And that's exactly what was happening across Kenya. What began as scattered outrage had become a coordinated pulse. From Nairobi's city blocks to the rural roads of Kisii and Baringo, people were no longer asking for attention, they were demanding a future. Makeshift kitchens fed the hungry. Volunteer medics treated the wounded in back rooms and churches. Neighborhoods built their own signal systems, using whistles and lights to warn of approaching security forces. But just as unity was rising, betrayal slipped through the cracks. A leak. A voice recording. Clear and chilling. A senior political figure speaking without shame: "Let the protests continue. The chaos creates opportunity. While they burn, we build." Those words, caught by accident and spread like wildfire, shattered whatever trust remained. This wasn't mismanagement. This was manipulation. The people weren't just being ignored, they were being used. Within hours of the recording's leak, cities ignited again. Not with fire, but with silence. Tens of thousands gathered in complete stillness, mouths taped shut, fists raised high. Across the nation, the message was clear: we see you. And we will not be silent anymore. But silence, no matter how powerful, couldn't stop what was already moving in the dark. Night raids resumed. Community leaders disappeared. Journalists found their equipment stolen, their families threatened. A new kind of war had begun, not one of tanks and uniforms, but of fear, of shadows, of control. Foreign operatives were rumored to be advising strategy. Private security forces, anonymous and heavily armed, started showing up at protest perimeters. No badges. No names. Just dark SUVs and encrypted radios. No one knew who they answered to. Some said foreign investors. Others whispered about deep state contracts. But one thing was clear: they weren't here to protect the people. The economy, already wounded, began to bleed. Inflation soared. Food prices doubled. Schools closed not just from unrest, but from hunger. Parents watched helplessly as their children's futures evaporated. And yet, amidst the weight of survival, the resistance grew sharper. Youth councils began drafting legal proposals. Lawyers offered pro bono defense to arrested protesters. Musicians wrote anthems. Pain turned into poetry. Rage turned into roadmaps. And still, above it all, the forests kept burning. Satellite images showed deliberate fire lines, geometric and precise. These weren't accidents. They were engineered. Protected green zones vanished overnight. Biodiversity decimated. Reports surfaced of government-linked firms filing claims for the now-cleared land. What was once protected in the name of the people was being auctioned behind closed doors. It became obvious: the destruction of nature wasn't collateral damage. It was the goal. But every fire lit in secrecy lit another fire in the hearts of the people. They started tracking, documenting, archiving everything. Protesters turned into citizen journalists. Farmers installed drone cameras. Exiled Kenyans formed global coalitions. The cry for justice had become global. And the government, realizing its grip was slipping, returned to its oldest tool: distraction. A counter-narrative emerged. Protesters were labeled radicals, foreign agents, criminals. Billboards showed patriotic slogans. Media ran stories of order restored. But no one believed them. Not anymore. The people had seen too much. Buried too many. Heard too many screams swallowed by silence. They had crossed the point of no return. And when a nation reaches that point, it does not ask for reform, it demands rebirth. The streets were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with conviction. Not chaos, but clarity. And that clarity was beginning to frighten those who once claimed to lead. Because they were no longer leading. They were chasing shadows. The more they tried to rewrite the story, the clearer the truth became. Every poster accusing protesters of treason, every news anchor spinning chaos into peace only made people more certain they were on the right side of history. Trust in state media evaporated. The people turned to each other. To encrypted chat rooms, to underground podcasts, to shared drives filled with footage too raw for television. They built a new kind of press, one that didn't wait for permission to report. But even truth has enemies. Late one night, a group of independent journalists disappeared after publishing a report linking deforestation contracts to the relatives of high-ranking officials. No arrests were made. No search conducted. Their offices were raided. Their laptops wiped. But backups survived, and the report went viral within hours. Names were exposed. Account numbers. Signatures. It became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, climate scientists began speaking out, risking their careers to confirm what protesters already knew: the fires were man-made. Water sources were being poisoned. Trees planted over generations reduced to ash for commercial profit. The environment wasn't a casualty, it was a target. Elders from rural communities began marching for the first time in decades. These were men and women who had survived colonial rule, who had buried children during famine, who knew what it meant to lose everything. And they had seen enough. They walked beside the youth, hands blistered, eyes tired, but steps steady. Generations that had once stood apart were now united. Not in ideology, but in pain. Somewhere in this growing storm, a name started echoing louder: Miriam Mwangi. A soft-spoken teacher from Nakuru, she had never marched, never raised her voice in public. But one day, after her students were caught in a tear gas incident near their school, she picked up a microphone at a local rally and spoke for 7 minutes straight. Her words weren't angry. They were honest. And in a country drowning in spin, honesty was like fire. "You do not poison a child's lungs and call it policy," she said. "You do not set fire to the only trees we have left and call it progress." That clip traveled farther than anyone expected. Within 3 days, international media picked it up. Within a week, Miriam was invited to speak at a climate summit. But she declined. "I don't want to speak for Kenya," she told a reporter. "I want Kenya to speak for itself." She returned to her classroom, to her students, to the front lines. Her choice said more than any speech could. And while international eyes turned toward the movement, pressure mounted on the government to respond. At first, they blamed outsiders. Then opposition parties. Then unnamed foreign influences. But no one was listening anymore. People didn't want excuses. They wanted change. And then came a moment that shattered any illusion of control. A nationwide blackout. Power gone. Network silenced. ATMs down. No official explanation. But leaked footage showed men in uniform storming telecommunications towers. The state had pulled the plug, literally. They wanted silence. Instead, they unleashed fury. Within hours, people lit fires not to destroy, but to communicate. Signals on rooftops. Lanterns in patterns. Smoke trails spelling words only the people could read. They spoke without words, planned without phones. And that night, Kenya didn't go dark. It glowed. From the valleys to the estates, the message was clear: we don't need your permission to be heard. Diplomats began arriving under the guise of peacekeeping. Some brought aid. Others brought warnings. Restore order, they said, or lose funding. But funding meant nothing to people who had already lost everything. In one dramatic scene, a young activist stood on a rooftop holding a torn flag in one hand and a dead tree branch in the other. "If we must choose," he shouted, "we choose the branch. Because at least it still remembers how to grow." That image became the new symbol of the movement. Not fire. Not fists. But growth. Rooted. Defiant. Alive. Kenya was no longer asking who caused the fire. Kenya was asking who would dare stop the healing. And more importantly, who would try to prevent it. They expected the movement to collapse under exhaustion. But fatigue didn't silence them, it sharpened their focus. As weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to unfold. Instead of fading, the protests evolved. They transformed from marches into movements, from slogans into policies. Organizers began forming task forces focused on reforestation, local governance, civic education, and digital freedom. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was strategy. And that terrified those in power more than any chant ever could. Because true power doesn't fear noise, it fears structure. Inside quiet community halls, elders met with youth leaders to design citizen charters. Lawyers who once stood silent in courtrooms now reviewed environmental loopholes in the law. Teachers revised lesson plans to include civic resistance and climate ethics. Kenya was rebuilding itself, without waiting for permission. Meanwhile, the regime scrambled. Every promise they made was met with one question: why now? Trust had eroded beyond repair. Their words sounded like rain falling on a roof already on fire. In a last-ditch effort, state officials offered a televised forum, a national dialogue for peace. But no one showed up. Not because people weren't listening, but because they no longer believed. Peace could not be negotiated on a stage drenched in denial. Then came the spark that changed everything. An anonymous whistleblower released a trove of documents, emails, contracts, surveillance footage. The leak revealed not just corruption, but coordination between government departments, corporate developers, and foreign consultants. The fires, the deforestation, the smear campaigns, the targeted arrests, they weren't isolated events. They were a strategy. A blueprint for privatizing national land, silencing dissent, and manipulating media narratives. The truth was no longer a theory. It was proof. Concrete. Chilling. In the face of undeniable evidence, people didn't riot. They organized more calmly than ever. A national petition began circulating. It didn't demand apologies. It demanded resignations. Trials. Restoration of forest lands. constitutional reviews. Within 48 hours, it had gathered over 2 million signatures. The government's response was to declare it foreign-influenced. But the people just laughed. There was nothing foreign about demanding to breathe clean air, to speak freely, to not be gunned down for raising a flag. The tipping point arrived not with noise, but with quiet. A coordinated national shutdown. On a Monday morning, streets were empty. Markets closed. Schools silent. No protesters. No police. Just stillness. The economy froze. The message was simple: if you won't listen to our voices, then feel our absence. It worked. The regime cracked, not publicly, but internally. Ministers began resigning. International donors suspended agreements. Climate lawsuits were filed. For the first time in months, accountability felt within reach. But the people knew better than to celebrate too early. This was not the end. It was the threshold. A point of no return where a country doesn't just react, it redefines itself. In one powerful image, a girl no older than 9 planted a tree where a burnt stump once stood. Around her were children, silent, watching. No flags. No signs. Just life being returned to soil that had tasted too much ash. That image spread across the world, not as a symbol of resistance, but of restoration. Because Kenya was never just burning from rage. It was burning to clear space for something new. And now, that something had begun. The fire didn't win. The people did. And in their victory, they didn't raise their fists. They planted roots. Quietly. Permanently. Unshakably.